With Aristotle, we come to the quintessence, the summit of Greek philosophy. He is a student of Plato, so that's part of it. He is an associate and friend, as you all know, of Alexander. So we're back to where we were last week. When you think about it, the chances of the most brilliant man, I would say the most brilliant man ever in Greece, but maybe the most brilliant philosopher of all time, being the tutor of one of the most extraordinary political leaders of all time, is so astounding and so amazing and so unlikely that it just knocks you down, really, when you think about it. But it's important to think about it because the link is what is so fascinating about last week and this week. That's exactly the essential core to what we're talking about here. Last week we talked about a Greek leader who takes Greek language and culture all over the world and gives Greek language to all the places that he goes to. It's true, he conquers a lot of people die in the wars, no question about it, that's not good. But as a byproduct of this push across the whole of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world, all the way into India, as a byproduct, he takes with him an idea, an ecumenical idea, an idea of bringing all the world together, and a language that can do it, or a tool that can do it, a language tool that can do it, and then gives this to the people. Now, at the very same time, his tutor, Aristotle, is thinking of writing an encyclopedia, i.e. a collection of books, that will describe everything in the world. In other words, when he was completed, he expected that he would have covered everything, that he would have written a book on every single subject that a philosopher could write about, that he would become the ecumenical philosopher of his time. He would become the philosopher who would do in knowledge what his student Alexander had done in the political world. You get it? So it's astounding pretensions. It's astounding, one could say, arrogant pretensions to ecumenicity, that is, worldwide sweep. One can denounce it as excessive, but of course, it was admirable in the sense that it was the only person who thought like this, either politically or philosophically. And what Aristotle does is give us, because we're still living with the gift from Aristotle, Aristotle gives us the structure of the entire philosophical field, so that when he's gone, what he leaves behind can be shared all through the whole world and nourish dozens of philosophical schools in dozens of different countries, in dozens of different languages. So the idea that Aristotle and Alexander would go together, that they were together, that they not only knew each other but adored each other, is to me one of the fascinating combinations of all of history, because they are thinking in the same way. It's just in two different fields. One's a political leader, military leader, and the other is a leader into knowledge, is a investigator into knowledge. So, I'm talking more about Aristotle here tonight, not because he's more important, but I think he is. But that could be an argument, and one can talk about that. But more because the Aristotelian contribution has no gaps in it. That is, the impact of Aristotle is continuous. That doesn't mean all his books are known, but the impact of Aristotle is continuous, whereas the impact of Plato is not. So there's a huge interruption in the heritage of Plato for various reasons, and there is not such an interruption in Aristotle. So it's better to talk, if you're going to take one of the two, take Aristotle. But if we were doing a whole course on Greek philosophy, of course, then we would have many, many nights on both of them. Friends, teachers, very much connected one to the other, and in agreement on most things. Now, there were disagreements between them on how we acquire knowledge or how we put knowledge together or how we draw our conclusions. But essentially, they agree on the big stuff. So, for example, they're both opponents of materialism, meaning they would agree you can't finally explain everything in the universe just on the basis of material or materialism. So they're opponents of materialism. They both agree that a real knowledge of a real existing universe is possible. Now, all of you who've studied philosophy, Chris is an expert on a lot of modern philosophy, so she could tell you that there are whole schools in the 19th century and 20th that deny those two propositions. So they would say it's all an illusion. We don't really have any way of knowing there's anything. We don't know there's an institute. We don't know this room is here. We don't even know that Bill is talking. It could be all an illusion, that there's a huge screen up here and we're just projecting a pre-recorded tape of the whole thing. But they agreed, not a dream. There's a real knowledge of the real universe. They also agreed the act of cognition, meaning knowledge, putting knowledge together, is a spiritual process and is the highest act of the human being. So they agreed on that there's a beauty, a greatness, a uniqueness to the human experience and human being in our pursuit of knowledge. They both agreed the universe has a design and a purpose. So that put them in line with Abraham, Isaac, David, Jesus, Paul. Therefore, when there were individuals in Rome who were going to have to deal with both the Greco-Roman heritage and the Judeo-Christian, they would be able to do it on this principle, because they would be able to bring together those two stories based on this conclusion, that we can know real knowledge about the real world and that the universe has a design and a purpose. They both agreed that the good is to be equated with the real. In other words, you can find the good and you can do the good, and it's really here in this world. They would both agree the good life is the goal of all rightly ordered activity. They both agreed the human soul differs from any other living being, that man does not owe his existence to any just purely material agency. Again, that's a rejection of materialism. And that the highest principle of man's highest activity is eternal, is deathless. So, in these important ideas, Plato and Aristotle are together. So the Platonic and the Aristotelian heritage for the West, for Western civilization, is essentially unitary. There will be much discussion in later centuries in European philosophy about debates over the act of knowledge, the act of cognition, how we gather information for knowledge, how we form it, but they basically agree. So this brings us to Aristotle. I don't think we could exaggerate the importance of Aristotle in world history, whether it's philosophical study of philosophy or the study of literature, the study of language, the study of botany. I mean, you go on and on and on through a list of subjects. Aristotle is the fountainhead. He is the beginning of so much. Why? Why was this? How did this happen? Well, number one, his productivity was extraordinary. He wrote 400 books. That's very good. I mean, that's productive. I would be happy with 200. So 400 books, and they're important books. Now, some are short, but still, they're important books, and they've lasted, and so therefore, it's really quite extraordinary. He is born in Macedon, so he's born in the north, in Macedon, in the territory of Philip II. So he's growing up with a family that knows Philip, knows the king of Macedon. And his father was a doctor, and so his father actually took care of Philip at various times. And so he's certainly an upper class boy. He's growing up in a very fine family and in Macedon. In 364, so he's 20 years old, he went to Athens and was studying with Plato. So 364, you all know that's before the birth of Alexander. He's 20 years old, and so he's in Athens in 364. In 343, Philip asked him to come back to Macedon and tutor his son Alexander. And so now Aristotle began to tutor Alexander and his best friend Hephaestion and Ptolemy, their other friend. And there were probably some other boys in the school too. So whoever those boys were, they got the opportunity to study with Aristotle, which would be very nice, wouldn't it, to be able to walk around and when people start saying, well, I went to Harvard and I went to Princeton, then you say, well, I went to Aristotle. I mean, I graduated from the University of Aristotle, and that's way better than Harvard or Princeton. In 336, Philip was assassinated, and so his student and friend Alexander became king of Macedon at age 20, and very soon set out on his travels in 334, and Aristotle went to Athens. So both of them left Macedon, Alexander to lead his international crusade, one could call it, and Aristotle then left Macedon and went back to Athens, and now set up his school, which would be the Lyceum, to which many students would come. And so for the next 10 years, from 334 down to 324, so Aristotle is in Athens, the head of the most prestigious school, so hundreds and hundreds of boys are coming from all over the world to study at his academy, his Lyceum. And during this time, he's writing his books. So it's these 10 years, the great productivity, which means that's like, 40 a year. I mean, that's, of course, it isn't all concentrated, just those 10, but most of it is. Now, his work as a philosopher, thinker, and writer, he's dictating those books. If you're wondering how you write 400 books, he had secretaries. And he could actually dictate 2 different books at the same time. But he certainly has secretaries, and he's dictating. And in some cases, he would teach a course, and then he would have students, there taking down his words, and then they would work on it, edit it, and publish it as a book. Which is what a lot of people at Stanford do right today. They give lectures and they have their students take the notes and then they send it off to the publisher. So from 334 down to 323, Aristotle is teaching in Athens while Alexander is traveling the world. Now the two of them are always in touch, so there's a huge amount of correspondence back and forth, because Alexander was very devoted to Aristotle and to his idea of this university, of this school. So Alexander donated a huge sum. We can't even calculate what it would be now because it's 2,300 years later, so we can't even guess. But it would be $100 million or $200 or $300 million, that is, in his time. So he gave Aristotle a huge amount of money to fund the research that Aristotle was doing. And what Aristotle wanted to do, because his field was every single subject. He wasn't just writing metaphysics. He was writing botany. He was writing zoology. So he wanted to set up at his university, for instance, the first botanical garden we've ever heard of in all of history, a botanical garden. So therefore, since he was setting up a botanical garden, he was delighted to receive from Alexander all kinds of offerings for his botanical garden, and so shipments would be arriving down at the Piraeus in the port of Athens, huge crates, huge gardens of stuff that's going to Aristotle from Alexander. And of course, all the people in the port knew exactly what it was and where it was coming from. He also set up the first zoo that we've ever heard of. So you can imagine Alexander was delighted to send him all kinds of lions and tigers and everything else on his trips to go to the zoo. So these cages would arrive at Athens for Aristotle, and they would go into the they would go into the zoo. So Aristotle was building, and then writing down, descriptions of the animals, and later possibly doing dissections of the bodies, and then describing their skeleton, etc. So the two of them together essentially were building a kind of center of world knowledge. It's sort of a world knowledge study institute in Athens. And so for that 10 years, the two of them really are, in a way, they're working together. Aristotle is pursuing his huge project of studies, and Alexander is pursuing his huge project. Alexander died suddenly, very, very young, 33 years old. And so Aristotle left Athens. And his famous quote was, he was not going to allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, meaning that he was very unwelcome in Athens when Alexander died, because he was a very close associate of Alexander, and the Athenians hated Alexander. You remember? Remember all that? That he had conquered Athens. He had conquered all of Greece and unified it. So all the city-states hated Alexander, saw him as a tyrant, hated him, and hated Aristotle for being a close friend of Alexander. So when Alexander died, Aristotle had to get out of town. So he went to a lovely northern country, a villa that his mother had owned at Chalcis, and died in 722. 322. Why did I say 7?